Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 8446, the Critical Mineral Consistency Act of 2024. H.R. 8446, introduced by Representative Ciscomani, would amend the Energy Act of 2020 to add critical materials from the Department of Energy Critical Materials List to the United States Geological Survey's Critical Minerals List.
So let me tell you a little bit about what happens if you get placed on the USGS list, which does not apply to the DOE list. It means that companies are eligible for millions of dollars in tax credits and grants under various bills that Congress has passed, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and many others. It also allows for permit streamlining under previous legislation that Congress has passed. Now, what that essentially translates into is expedited reviews. And folks at home may be saying, well, isn't that a good thing? Well, if you look at the environmental, social, cultural impacts of mines and how they affect communities, you need a federal process that makes it possible for our communities to weigh in. There is a public comment process so that you can go and say, hey, we don't want this mine in this place. For our tribes, it puts into place a federal consulting process so that our tribes can protect their sacred and ancestral lands. For communities, they can comment on the environmental and water impacts of potential mine operations. For our public lands, it means we can protect the sites that are used for recreation, for fishing, and the values that we hold dear for both environmental and recreational purposes. And importantly, it also affects the impact of whether or not, after mines go in, there is liability and legal remedy for the pollution that mines cause. If our public is not able to comment on mines during the permitting process, they will not have judicial standing if these mines are abandoned or there's not appropriate care taken in the aftermath of the mine operations and efforts to close the mine down and remediate the lands. That means that the public taxpayers and the people are left holding the bag, not the multinational mining corporations who are seeking to open these lands for mining.
The bill cuts across jurisdictional red tape while preserving each agency's discretion and expertise in adding items to its list. Both critical minerals and critical materials are just that, critical. Without reliable access to essential materials such as cobalt and lithium for batteries and copper and aluminum for transmission lines, the U.S. risks failing to meet future economic and energy demands. Such a situation would lead to increased dependence on the market decisions of adversarial nations for critical minerals and materials. H.R. 8446 passed out of the Natural Resources Committee on a bipartisan vote because both sides of the aisle understand the importance of critical minerals and materials. I encourage my colleagues to once again come together to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 8446. This bill has a fairly innocuous seeming purpose on its face. It would amend the Energy Act of 2020 to add critical minerals as designated by the Department of Energy to the USGS, which is the agency that handles minerals issues for the United States, to a list of critical minerals. My colleagues across the aisle will argue that this bill is simply for consistency, to streamline, that we have too many lists to manage critical minerals and materials, which of course are so important to our country. So it's important to harmonize these lists and make sure that we are operating the federal government in a streamlined manner. But it's critical that the American people understand that this is not the full story. In fact, this bill is the direct result of years of heavy lobbying and influence to the critical minerals list. Because as you see, the critical minerals list is defined as all non-fuel minerals that are used as essential materials for national security or that may pose a supply chain vulnerability to disruption. The critical minerals list is designed to focus attention and vital resources on the most essential and at-risk mineral supply chains. USGS's critical minerals list and DOE's critical mineral list may sound similar, but they have different purposes because of the differences in how these lists are used and the federal mandates for these agencies. They have different purposes that are not interchangeable. The Energy Act of 2020 directed USGS to update the list of critical minerals to guide its use for infrastructure investments under the legislation that we passed here in 2021. As directed by a separate provision in the Energy Act of 2020, the Department of Energy undertook its own assessment of critical materials that were specific to energy needs, because that's what the Department of Energy focuses on. USGS is the agency that has existed since the 19th century here in the United States to take stock of, to identify, and to support the federal government in understanding our geology, our minerals, and what we do with them. It affects the entire economy, and it may sound very simple to streamline and combine these lists, but not only do they have different purposes, they have far-ranging consequences. The importance of the USGS critical minerals list cannot be understated. This list drives billions of dollars in federal investment and permitting decisions. So when you look at it in its totality, the very seemingly simple act of just saying, let's harmonize these two lists and put it all under the rubric of the Department of Energy's list may seem like a simple no-brainer. But what it amounts to in its totality is a massive multi-million-dollar giveaway to multinational corporations that are seeking to mine public lands in the United States. And it should be no surprise that it is industry lobbyists that have been working to get this change in the law for years. And we have seen many different incarnations of this bill, some of which have been very explicit about copper in particular being added to the list, and some of which are a little more opaque, like the bill we see in front of us today. But it's very clear that the copper industry is who is driving this bill in front of us today. Now, we have to be realistic. Copper is an incredibly important resource. It is used in everything from our transmission lines to our electronics, consumer products, cars and trucks. And even though it is designated as a critical material for energy purposes under the DOE list, it is not currently on the USGS list because it is not at risk of supply chain disruption. In fact, the United States is a net exporter of copper. Let me repeat that. Copper is not at risk of supply chain disruption. We are exporting our copper. So why is industry pushing so hard to open new mines on our public lands? Well, guess what? There's a lot of money to be made. And it turns out that the major holder of the two companies that are pushing for this bill is the Chinese government. How ironic is that? In fact, we know that over 10% of one of the largest copper mining multinational companies in the world that is seeking to open a copper mine in Arizona is pushing for this bill to expedite the permitting, to reduce the timelines, to make sure that the public and tribes cannot comment on whether or not they want the mine there. We know that there are mine sites that have been identified that would be on sacred lands, and we know that it would have devastating impacts for the water supply of the state of Arizona and the entire Southwest. But in addition to that, copper mining is an incredibly disruptive activity. It is pollution heavy, it impacts the landscape, smelters are notorious for emitting air pollutants, and in Arizona, arsenic levels have been recorded at 150 times higher than state health guidelines posing higher cancer risks to communities. And we know the well-known impacts to water and to acid mine drainage in our communities. But on top of all of this, and I think this is the part that should raise all of our concerns, is that the copper industry is trying to use their influence through lobbying, through campaign donations to our colleagues, and it should be of no surprise that the primary sponsor of this bill and the other bills like it come from the very state where these mining companies are seeking to mine, are on sites that have already been identified as unsuitable for copper mining. They are tribal sacred sites in a number of cases. There has literally been decades of effort from the copper industry because there are high quality copper deposits in many of these places, including in Oak Flat, which is a place that has been held sacred by the Apache people since time immemorial. Why are our friends across the aisle trying to advance a lobbying bill on behalf of a multinational set of corporations which are held in part by Chinese government inholdings on American lands that would violate the basic human, cultural, and religious rights of our indigenous communities? I let the American people decide why they think that's happening, but it is certain that we just came out of an election, isn't it? So I think that it's crucial that people understand that this isn't a simple streamlining bill. This isn't about just, oh, we should harmonize this list with that list. This is about foreign influence on the mining industry, on the copper industry here in the United States. And I ask my colleagues across the aisle who have voted time and time again on this very floor to prevent foreign companies held by our adversaries, including China, from buying American lands, from trying to take American water rights. Why on earth would you be advancing a bill that would literally give away mining concessions to companies that are held by foreign adversaries? And why would you do it when we know that our communities have already resoundingly said, no, we do not want these mines in our communities. They will harm our cultures, our communities, our waters, and our public lands. So I look forward to hopefully getting some answers to these questions, but the American people should understand what this bill actually is. And I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 8446, and I reserve the balance of my time.